Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 64 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As the curtain rises in Athens, it is the eve of a wedding between Theseus, the Duke of Athens, and his conquered bride Hippolyta, the Queen of the Amazons. Before their festivities begin, however, several more stories of love lost and found are to be played out. A quartet of young lovers who have been thwarted from being with the one they desire flee to the forest outside the city to seek their own happiness. The forest is a magical realm inhabited by fairies who, over the course of one extended night, intervene in the lovers' affairs with perverse consequences. When the lovers emerge to find themselves happily matched, they count it all a dream, a Midsummer Night's Dream. This is, of course, William Shakespeare's first great comedy, and undoubtedly one of his most enduringly popular with producers and audiences alike. A Midsummer Night's Dream has all the ingredients of a classic romantic comedy: a magical setting, a merry-go-round of earnest young lovers, a fairy king and queen, and a troupe of hapless comic actors, all given a supernatural spin in the course of a single moonlit night. As we record this episode, a new production of the play is in repertory in this summer's season at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, where the artistic director, Michelle Terry, gives an outstanding performance as the sardonic sprite Puck. While roaming the Globe's website recently, I came across an article about the dream by Professor Emma Smith, and I took this as a sign that I should invite her to come back to the podcast to share her knowledge of the play. Loyal listeners will recall that Emma has twice before been gracious enough to appear on the podcast. First in our episode about John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, and then again to talk through Shakespeare's Scottish play. I'm delighted to say that we are now thrice lucky to be able to take advantage of Emma's deep knowledge. Welcome, Emma. Thanks so much for picking up the gauntlet once again.
Thank you, Doug. It's a great pleasure.
Just so that you all understand how lucky we are to have her, I will remind you that Emma Smith is Professor of Shakespeare Studies at Hertford College, University of Oxford. Her books on Shakespeare's First Folio, The Making of the First Folio, and Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 Centuries of an Iconic Book, have been published in new editions to coincide with the 400th anniversary this year of the folio. She is currently working on an edition of Twelfth Night and a new book on Elizabethan art and culture. So, Emma, I mentioned the perpetual popularity of the play. My opening question is, what do you think it is about this play that makes it such a favorite?
That's a really great question. I mean, you covered some of those elements. I suppose what I would say about this play is it's very mobile. We move between groups of characters quite quickly. And so we move between different plots and subplots. The play is linguistically very, very diverse and fun. It's no surprise to me that it's perhaps been one of the plays that's most inspired music, because it has a musical quality of different kinds of rhythms and different kinds of speeches, from the fairies and Puck, who you mentioned, to the rhyming couplets of the lovers, to sort of grandstanding by the political characters, the ruling characters. It's a great play to listen to, and it's a great fun play. I think it's been a play which, certainly since the Victorian period, has been seen to be a good introduction to Shakespeare, perhaps for younger people. So it's got a lot going for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, it's interesting. I did read, and you come across people who say it probably is the first Shakespeare play that they're taken to. There's some idea that this is going to be accessible, as you say, to younger people as well, though I think there's more to it than that, which we'll obviously delve into. And I was going to ask you where the play fits in the chronology of Shakespeare's career. I mentioned that I said first great comedy. It's not his first comedy, but possibly his first great comedy. Where does it fit in terms of the time it was written and the style and subject of the play?
This is a play from about 1595 to 6, just to remind you. Shakespeare begins his career probably around 1590, perhaps a little bit earlier. And in that first decade, he's writing comedies. as we've got here, and plays based on English history. That's most of his creative work at that point. And then the second decade of his work, perhaps from the turn of the 17th century, turns to tragedy, and then towards the late plays that we sometimes call romances. So this is early, mid-1590s, perhaps 1595 to 6. One of its close neighbours in Shakespeare's notebook, as it were, must have been Romeo and Juliet, and the relationship between these plays has been the subject of a lot of discussion. There are ways that Midsummer Night's Dream seems to satirise the whole notion of love at first sight that is so tragically depicted in Romeo and Juliet, perhaps most particularly in Midsummer's play within a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, which is a hilarious, often hammed up version of sort of tragic lovers and misrecognising or misinterpreting signs. So that's where it is. You're right that it's not the first comedy Shakespeare has written, but it's early in what's going to become the romantic comedies of the next 4 or 5 years. So it's a sign of Much Ado About Nothing and As You Like It and Twelfth Night, which are all to come.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the connection with Romeo and Juliet. Funnily enough, this very day, I'm going to see Romeo and Juliet in a new production at the Almeida. So I'm intrigued to see the relationship there. And in fact, we'll talk about the play within the play, which has some of the same tragic elements as Romeo and Juliet. One of the captivating features of the play, of course, is its setting in this magical forest. And I wondered if there were sources for the fairy world that Shakespeare creates here. And also, what do you think the import of this setting is? What does it bring to the play?
So people who are sort of aficionados of Shakespeare or of Shakespeare's comedies might recognise a technique here. And that's the technique that the great Canadian critic Northrop Frye called the green world comedies. And what happens in these plays is there is a problem in the real world established early on in the play. And in order to sort this out, or to give the time and space in which the problem can be resolved, some of the characters, our main characters, move to a different setting, often a setting associated with the natural world rather than the world of the court. And there is something recuperative or regenerative about Midsummer Night's Dream. In fact, it's very interesting in our own moment to think of this as a sort of eco-conscious play. One of the things we hear from the fairy king and queen, who are in a huge cataclysmic argument, is that their argument has disturbed the weather, brought great problems to harvests and so on. There is a turmoil in nature here. So there are ways in which that natural world can seem like an escape to us, but probably in our own period gathers with it its own pressing versions of topicality. So in some ways, I think this green space, the wood outside Athens, is a magical space, a space, as you say, populated with fairies and so on. On the other hand, it's often seen to be a version of English countryside, perhaps the countryside around Stratford. We remember that Shakespeare is a country boy from a market town. And that famous speech, I know a bank where the wild thyme grows, that feels like a sort of herbarium or a list of plants, a kind of botanical catalogue that might be more appropriate to the banks around the River Avon than perhaps to Athens. So like most of Shakespeare's places, I suppose that's to say, it's an amalgam of the imaginary, the real, the immediate, and the far away or the exotic.
I love the idea that some of these descriptions and some of this lovely language about the natural world may have come from his own personal experience about where he grew up and maybe hankers for even when he's in the city. But you're right also about the scenic structure of the play, where you have the urban world's problems, which you can escape to the forest and somehow air and resolve. There's sort of something cathartic about that, I guess. Also, where the established rules are temporarily dissolved and other behaviors are allowed until you come back to some kind of reconciliation or resolution and return to the status quo or a slightly altered status quo.
Yeah, it's been a big question about whether what we get at the end of comedy is pretty much what we had at the beginning, but people feel a bit happier and reconciled to it, or whether comedy is really sort of transformational and changes the world. That great question about whether comedy is a really small c conservative genre, which doesn't want anything to change. And these look like fantasies of change, but which reinstate the values that we set out with.
Well, absolutely. And that is a question which will come to, but much later when we get towards the end. And I wanted to ask you about how we feel about this so-called resolution or comic ending. I mentioned actually about the sources for this world because I couldn't actually discover that there was any specific source for a lot of this, maybe elements for the story. But in terms of the realm he creates, this magical sort of world of the fairies, there's also, as you suggest, or the title suggests, there's an association, of course, between the forest and what goes on there and a sort of dream world. We're sort of entering during the night into our dream world, into our subconscious even, as the source of our dreams, and exploring that in some ways. So it has that kind of power too, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you're right to bring me back to the question of the sources. I wonder if it's connected with your sense that this is Shakespeare's first great comedy. It may well be significant that this is a play without really a single major source. Most of Shakespeare's plays can be traced quite directly to prose stories, which he is transforming into dramas. And that's not really the case here. We've got Ovid, and the great text of Elizabethan imagination was Ovid's Metamorphoses, the idea of change, things being able to transform into other things. That was sort of key to their imagination, I think. We've got bits of Chaucer, the Knight's Tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which gives us Theseus and Hippolyta. But we don't really have a major source that we can look to and think this is where this comes from. So there is something about Shakespeare's imaginative powers which takes a step up in his career at this point.
Yeah, if you think about it in those terms, and every detail of this play, it's just miraculous what his fecund imagination has come up with, frankly. Of course, many listeners will be familiar with the play, but for those who know or remember it less well, Emma, perhaps it would be able to give a brief summary of the main characters and storylines so that people can follow along with us.
Well, you gave a pretty good summary of it. Let's think about different groups of characters in the play. So we have a group of people who belong to Athens, ruled over by Duke Theseus, whose wedding to his captured Amazon queen, Hippolyta, is just about to take place, as you said. And from that world of Athens escape two pairs of lovers, Hermia and Lysander, Helena and Demetrius, and they escape the world of Athens to go into the wood. In the woods, they meet with several other groups. One is the entourage around Queen Titania, the queen of the fairies, a group of fairy underlings and train, and King Oberon of the fairies, whose servant Puck is in some way the guiding spirit of the whole play. Also in the wood is a group of working people. They tend to be called the rude mechanicals, rude in sort of unsophisticated or uncivilized rather than in its more modern sense. And they are rehearsing a play which they're going to put on for the wedding celebrations for Theseus and Hippolyta. And the plot really is about the ways these groups all interact and the confusions and misapprehensions that arise through that.
Okay, great. Because I was going to ask you in a bit about the structure. You talked earlier about the interwoven subplots because there are these different groups of characters, which he very deftly weaves together. And there are symmetries amongst them as well, right?
Yes, completely. And these are symmetries which are amplified probably in the dramaturgy, in the way this play is put together. So it seems pretty likely that the actors who played Theseus and Hippolyta, the Athenian rulers, also played Oberon and Titania, the fairy world. And once you see that doubling, you immediately begin to see that the wood is not necessarily the opposite of the court, but it's something more like it's unconscious or it's shadow side or, a version of the same thing. And that gets us a bit to some of the very fruitful implications of dream, which you started to bring out.
Yes. And of course, you have the four lovers. Basically, it's a mix and match So we have 4 royal lovers, and we have 4 of the younger lovers from the court. And I also wanted to ask you, though, about the structure in the sense that we have these romantic plots about, who's with whom. And one of the odd things about the play, seems to me, is that those romantic plots are all resolved by the end of Act 4. And yet we still have then a whole nother act where we see the play within the play that you mentioned. These artisans come to the wood to rehearse and then are going to put on for the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. But I wanted to just ask you why he structured it like that, because it seems a bit risky in some ways. It's like you've wrapped up the whole story and then you have to sit around for another 20 minutes or more to watch a coda of sorts.
That's a really interesting observation. I mean, one way to see that might be that the great set piece of this play is actually the play within the play, Pyramus and Thisbe. So that is the climax of the play, rather than any sort of plot point about whether these marriages will take place or not. I mean, one could say that there isn't very much jeopardy in this play. This is a version of romantic comedy where the reassurance that's intrinsic to that genre, that actually the couples will get together, we don't quite know how, but they will, that reassurance maybe here is not cut with quite enough, jeopardy or anxiety about whether they will. So in some ways, I'm not sure this is a romantic comedy, or it may be pointing towards it, because the investment of the play is not really with these Athenian lovers, with Helena and Hermia and Demetrius and Lysander. They're a part of the whole, but it's not their story arc which is going to structure the play. So when Shakespeare gets to later comedies like As You Like It, say, or Twelfth Night, it is the story arc of those main characters who are young lovers that shapes the play, but not quite so much here.
That's really well observed, because I was going to come straight on to talk about some of the themes about the fickleness of love, etc. And actually, one of the feelings one has is that you're not hugely invested in whether these characters are with each other or not. Because, as you say, it just seems a sort of formulaic manipulation of these plot lines for other purposes. And I was going to ask you that, for all the romance, as I described it, of this dreamlike setting, and we have this comic resolution, as you say, for the lovers, they all get properly matched and wed. The portrayal of love is quite satirical, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, it's hard for us perhaps to invest our own emotional energies in these lovers. I may just be saying that, though, I should confess, as a get out, because and I had to do it before talking to you today, I have to always look up which way round they go, because I can't get it straight in my mind. Is it Hermia and Demetrius? Is it Helena and Demetrius? That's part of the plot of the play, but I can't even get the kind of underlying couples who were going to be sort of instated at the end of the play.
So I want to interrupt you there. I'm sorry, because I'm so glad you, professor of Shakespeare at Oxford, have said that, because I feel the same thing. But it must be, as you suggested, deliberate, that they're almost interchangeable, these characters, especially the men, I would say.
I think that's right. And even when Hermia, she's absolutely implacably at odds with her father, Aegeus, who wants her to marry Demetrius. And Hermia says, no, she's going to marry Lysander. And her father says, you're going to marry Demetrius. She says, well, I'd rather die, or I'd rather go into a convent. I'm just not going to do that. And we get the force of that preference, but I think the play doesn't support that with any sense of how these men are different. And what is it that's so wonderful about Lysander and so absolutely terrible about Demetrius? Now, of course, that may be a way of thinking about the wonderful strangeness of love, that love makes the person we love into the only and most wonderful person, even if that is not really visible. And we hope it isn't visible in some ways to other people, because it's a kind of special privacy, isn't it, between lovers? But there is a sense, nevertheless, I think, that the play, by doubling these lovers and with a slight shrug about, well, however they're going to turn out, they will do, is satirizing the whole notion of romantic love, and particularly, I think, love at first sight. Love at first sight we think of as a kind of extended metaphor. But here, because Puck, Oberon's servant, is given a job of interfering in the affairs of the human world, he uses a magic flower to anoint the eyes of the sleeping Athenians so that when they wake up, the first thing they see, they fall in love with. And that really brings love at first sight into a kind of almost parodic quality and does poke a bit of fun at it, I think.
Yes, of course. And the couples are literally interchangeable based on sight, as you've just said. Actually, I also think that the men are almost undifferentiable, which of course informs the point about superficiality of their affections. They're also very shallow characters, deliberately slightly drawn, aren't they? I read in the Arden edition of the play that they suggested that the pairs of lovers in the more mature plays, as you referenced, As You Like It, etc., are endowed with more active personalities who influence their romantic outcomes more directly. And in this play, we just see a series of encounters where the lovers emphatically state their preferences, but we don't get much psychological edification about them or their relationships.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. We don't get any of that sort of differentiation. We get a sketchy, perhaps physical differentiation between Helena and Hermia, who are, different, have different physiques, and that may speak to the particular young male actors for whom these parts were originally written. But yeah, we're not getting an investment in the distinctiveness of these lovers, either in relation to each other or as interesting characters. They're not particularly interesting. And that's perhaps why, one feature of the ending of the play is that Demetrius, who has to be paired with Helena and has had some history with Helena, but now is not keen, his assent to this easy foursome at the end of the play, this kind of double dating, is secured by the magic potion. So he is in some ways still under the influence of this medicine when he agrees that he will marry Helena. Now, for some people, that's a great sort of problem about consent and so on. For me, it feels like the sort of ultimate expression of the arbitrariness of these passions. Passions isn't even quite the right word, is it? That's too strong and headstrong a word. And of course, as you pointed out, these are juxtaposed storylines. And what we get around these rather vapid, milksop kind of characters is the dark relationship tinged with the kind of violence between Theseus and Hippolyta, with which the play begins, and the incredible lover's passion which shakes the world of Oberon and Titania. So we've got these very grand, intense relationships either side of them, and that too clarifies the ways that the apparent central lover characters are a little bit too anodyne to carry that.
That's great you refer to these, because I would also like to ask you about the fact that I think there are some darker elements in this so-called romantic comedy in the portrayal of the relationships and of love. And just finishing off about the central lovers and the superficiality of it, of course, one of the basic facts of the plot is that they so easily switch their affections. And the men are patently shown to be unreliable. Their oaths are worth nothing. So there's a satirical comment, of course, on that. And coming to some of the darkness, they behave pretty vilely to the women. It's surprisingly stark, some of these insults where, Demetrius is trying to bat off Helena, who follows him doggedly into the wood and won't give up, even though Demetrius treats her almost, as she says, like a dog. And also Lysander, when albeit he's under the influence of the drug, he basically lashes back out at his supposed love Hermia, saying he hates her. Get you gone, you dwarf, and you burg, trying to shake her off. It's really quite nasty in places, isn't it?
It is nasty. It really is nasty. And there's also a sense of, at those points, I think you realise that particularly for the women, they're very, very vulnerable in this woodland setting. I think for Elizabethan audiences, the wood outside a city was a great sort of lawless place. It was not a safe place, particularly for women. It was a place associated with terrible crimes and abuse and so on, outside the eyes of the society. And we get hints of that too. Hermia is saying to Lysander, lie further off, be more proper, don't sort of crowd me, don't try and take advantage of me. So there is a darker sense, you're absolutely right, that the people you love can also turn against you and treat you with a terrible kind of wounding clarity. I find that section that you just mentioned, where Helena is almost masochistically asking Demetrius to spurn her and treat her like a dog, I find that incredibly difficult to read. She is really abused. She's an abused woman who thinks that her lover expresses care for her by, being so vile to her. She says, "I'll be your spaniel." And it was not until I got a spaniel myself that I realized just how unstintingly affectionate they are, as it's a very specific kind of dog, I think, that Shakespeare's talking about.
Oh, wow, that's brilliant. That's a detail I wouldn't have picked up, not owning a spaniel, but that's fantastic. Yes, you're right. It is uncomfortable to watch because she debases herself, essentially. And the more he treats her badly, the more she debases herself.
Yes, I think it's a difficult place for the audience because it's effectively done for our amusement.
Yeah.
We're supposed to find this funny, and that's very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was about to say it's usually portrayed as a running joke, isn't it? But I don't think in modern eyes it feels quite so funny. And as you mentioned, that scene where Hermia and Lysander find themselves alone, unchaperoned, it must be said, in the wood, possibly for the first time, and are spending the night together. They lie down, and she insists that he be further away because she really does legitimately fear that he's going to be taken advantage of.
Yes, it's a really good point you make there, that they're unchaperoned. I haven't thought that quite so clearly. We very, very rarely see these unmarried lovers in Shakespeare's plays on stage alone together. That's not really allowed in the society. There's a friend, there's a sister, there's a somebody. These are courtships which take place in plain view. So being alone together may be, exactly what the lovers desire, but it's also a moment of fear.
I mean, I guess as you reminded me that most of these courtships take place in some kind of formal social environment. And this is in a natural world, of course, without those rules or constraints. Actually, that brings me also to the point about the slightly darker undertones, as we've started to intimate about physical desire in these relationships. In particular, what about Titania falling for a donkey? I mean, she's obviously drugged to do so, but it, in some ways, is an unsettling image and trope, isn't it?
I think it's a deeply unsettling one. If you look at Victorian pictures of the play, they absolutely loved this idea of the fairy queen in her bower, stroking the ears of this donkey-headed man who is Bottom the Weaver, the irrepressible lead man in the play within the play that's being rehearsed. But it's clear really from the text of the play that Titania has a lot more than ear stroking in mind. And that this is a deeply sort of sexualized, bestial encounter in the wood. It's one of the ways that the wood upturns norms, I suppose, or, pushes at what's acceptable. And I think that one of the consequences of thinking of this play as a play suitable for children has been to underestimate the darker, more carnal, more libidinous sexual energies of the play. So we could be diverted by, as I say, these rather blander, younger lovers away from seeing the sexual energy and the dark sexual energy in both the, as I would see them, more grown-up couples, or this single couple that's both Theseus and Hippolyta and Oberon and Titania.
Yes, that's a great point because, again, it may signal that this is in some ways a representation in the wood of the subconscious, and these impulses are allowed to play out. It's interesting you mentioned the Victorian attitude, because I also read that the Victorian production editions wanted to edit this encounter to make it somehow more innocent. You talked about Titania just stroking the donkey's ear, and it isn't made explicit, but I think it's pretty difficult not to think that actual sex has gone on. And one of the clues I enjoyed discovering was that when she wakes, Titania says, "Methought I was enamored of an ass," which in our understanding of the definition of enamored means that she was in love with an ass. But it suggested in the notes I read that enamored more commonly then might have meant loved by.
Yes.
So she was actually loved by an ass.
Yes, and I think Bottom also, wakes up and is kind of, it's often a very funny moment on the stage where he is remembering this extraordinary encounter. So I think it is a physical encounter. That's how we're meant to see it. And as such, it embodies or opens up a more sexualized reading of the dream. I think that is the aforementioned spaniel. I'm so sorry, making a noise.
I love the fact that we have the spaniel in the podcast. I don't think I'm going to edit that out, Emma.
I was just thinking that the encounter between Titania and Bottom, the weaver, as an ass, opens up this more sexualized view of the play and of dreaming. So we can sometimes think of dreams as a sort of light form of escapism, or we can think with Freud about dreams as access to the things that are absolutely suppressed and can't be acknowledged in our everyday lives, but which come out in this dream life. And that gives, I think, a really interesting way to understand the wood, that it's a space where things that can't happen in real life, but are deeply, shamefully desired, nevertheless are present. So I was just going to say that it's a wonderful way that Shakespeare anticipates and, of course, has influenced much later sort of psychological understandings. And I was about to say it's as if Shakespeare had read Freud, but then as I said that, I thought, of course, I mean, Freud has read Shakespeare. That maybe that it's Midsummer Night's Dream that gives Freud in some way access to his own dream theories.
Yes, I listened to something about Oedipus Rex the other day and thinking that Freud obviously read Sophocles, not the other way around.
Yes.
Interesting, this darkness we've talked about, that it seems to be the women who come out as victims in this darker game of love, isn't it? That, as Puck says, Cupid is a knavish lad, thus to make poor females mad. I mean, to fall for men, but also you talked about their vulnerability. It's nothing new about their vulnerability in the world, is it? And let's face it, all these female characters are up against it in what is a patriarchal world, isn't it?
It completely is. And the play really establishes that very firmly in its opening 20 minutes. We've got Theseus, the Duke of Athens, who has taken this bride, the very chilling phrase, I wooed thee with my sword. You know, a kind of extraordinary thing to say. And then we've got Aegeus, the father of Hermia, saying, you know, she will do what he says or else. So we've got this really doubled down patriarchy. And so in some ways, the wood can seem like a more female or female-friendly space. There's a lovely part where Titania, we haven't talked yet about the changeling boy, who is the ostensible or perhaps the real source of the dispute between Oberon and Titania. But Titania gives a lovely lyrical description of the boy's mother and a sort of world of female friendships that seems to suggest that the wood could be an alternative space to these hard rules of patriarchal Athens. But as you say, unfortunately, what turns out in the wood is that the women are again vulnerable and subject to the whims of their menfolk.
Yeah, and Oberon doesn't let her have this boy.
Yes. And I suppose part of the darkness of the sexuality in the play, the unspeakableness of it, is the nature of this boy. What or who is it? Why is this an object of such desire, it seems, for both of them? Is it a child? Is it a young man? You know, we talk still about boy actors playing women's roles. And in that case, we mean boys who are into their teenage years. In the play, we never see the child, although quite often now in productions, we do see this figure, this source of the conflict.
I think what's interesting, going back to the patriarchy, is that Oberon and Titania have this struggle about who has the boy. Oberon tricks her, and in so doing actually ends up taking the boy away from Titania, and of course reduces her to this, what you described as bestial behavior with Bottom as an ass. And after all that, she apparently seems to accept the result and goes on with Oberon, new in amity, as he describes it, of course.
Mm.
And she virtually has no more lines after that reunion and after all that plot unfolds. So we don't see significant pushback from her about what's happened to her.
No, that's true, isn't it? There's two things there. One is that it may be our assumptions about the morality of the play that says that she has been demeaned by this. I mean, I have sometimes seen the play performed where this has been the night of her life. This has been wonderful. It's been a moment of, you know, extreme pleasure and, you know, the best kind of unconsequential one-night stand that you could imagine. So she goes off sort of much happier.
It's also odd, though, isn't it, that Oberon actually manufactures all of this.
Yes.
It's like he's pimped her out in some way, but he seems completely nonplussed by that. That doesn't bother him at all.
No, and I think these are ways, once we start to ask these questions, we see this opens up, sort of sexual pleasures and the interaction between couples, the erotic interaction between couples in some quite unexpected ways, some, as we might say now, non-vanilla ways. But the other point I was going to make is that if we take that structure of doubling seriously, the framing of the play means that we've got to go back to Theseus and Hippolyta. So Titania has actually got to have a quick costume change and come back as the Amazon queen. So that her fairy queen role has to be quite abruptly brought to a close in order to just practically get the actors. I remember hearing a costume maker talk about how long it takes to get into particularly a sort of high status costume in a period without zips, without Velcro. Most people, it seems, did not have sort of fastenings and unfastenings, but were often sewn into clothes. So the costume change time is a really crucial element of playtime that I think Shakespeare is very adept at manipulating. But this is quite a short one. And we can see the seams, as it were. We can see that Puck is given quite an inconsequential speech, which is really to cover up what must have been very, very hectic recostuming backstage to bring on Theseus and Hippolyta.
Oh, I love this, Emma. That's, again, something I've learned, the practical insight here into how Shakespeare constructed plays. I would never have occurred to me that. I mean, of course, just finishing on this powerlessness, in a sense, of the women in the play is that we talked earlier about Helena, who is entirely dependent on the whims of the men, as is Hermia, I guess, to choose her or not. She says, we cannot fight for love as men do. We should be wooed, and we're not made to woo. So it's all over to them. I wanted to move on to the character of Puck, because he is, as you talked about, in some ways, the engine of what goes on in the woods, at least. He's a wonderful character, isn't he? An instrument of chaos and mischief, as he describes himself as the merry wanderer of the night. There's something of the devil in this prankster, isn't there?
I think that's true, yeah. He's a puckish sprite, the sprite Robin Goodfellow, which is also his name in the play, and probably the name we should call him by. Robin Goodfellow was a well-known figure of folklore, mischievous, sometimes malign, active in the human world, stealing things, making things go awry, and also, again, a sort of figure of sexual energy. There's a great woodcut of Robin Goodfellow from the 1620s, so a little bit later than this play, but drawing on the same folklore traditions, where he is wearing an enormous phallus. This really is a phallic dancer or phallic symbol. So he too is part of the energy of this play, which has a sexual aspect to it, I think. And his misapprehensions, his work with the love in idleness flower, putting it on the eyelids of various people, creates and then to some extent reconciles the confusions of the plot. So he's almost a sort of playwright figure in a way, or, he moves between groups of characters and sets them up for their next scene and sort of instructs them in some way how to go. So his energies are partly sexual, as I've said, but they're also partly and importantly theatrical.
Yes. I think one of the things I like about the character, and certainly this comes out in Michel Terry's performance, as I mentioned at the top in the current Globe production, is that he enjoys wrecking mischief on the humans for mischief's sake, which I guess is the definition of puckishness in some way. And he seems to have this really sardonic view of human behaviors, as famously, as he said, Lord, what fools these mortals be. And there's a sort of detachment, isn't there, Emma, on his part from what goes on? He looks a little bit, as I say, sardonically scathing at what these mortals get up to. He's not really that invested or has any empathy for these hapless humans. He's a bit like a sort of chorus in a way, who's got this sardonic view of what everyone's up to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, I hadn't thought that quite so clearly, but yes, he is objective, ironic, disengaged from his own mischief. So he's doesn't have, as it were, skin in the game. It isn't affected by any of it. And maybe then points us towards what I suppose we've been talking about, really, a kind of wider absence of the emotional world to this play, that this is not Or if this is a play about emotions, they are dispersed and sort of almost externalized. They're almost expressionistic rather than being psychologically experienced or discussed. So you might put the emotional life of the characters out into the landscape, maybe, rather than thinking of it as a property of the inside. So it's a different view of character from the one that we're used to thinking about in later Shakespeare, where individuals carry within them the distinctiveness that makes them human.
Yes, and it's about their psychological makeup flaws or otherwise that drives what happens to them. And actually, I was just going to say, I'm thinking that maybe there's a contrast to that in Bottom and the artisans. I was going to ask you about the artisans, what, as you said, Puck describes as the rude mechanicals, and what their role in the play is. I believe that this is Shakespeare's first play to have ordinary working people as major characters. And I wanted to ask you what you think that does. You mentioned at the very beginning that we have these different societies, so to speak, courtiers and fairies and artisans. Is the play saying something about social class? You also talked about the entire play in the fifth act is essentially them.
Yeah. And there's a brilliant twist in that fifth act, often really brilliantly done by modern performers, where it feels as if the Pyramus and Thisbe is an absolute showcase of disastrous amateur theatre, and that, the language is ridiculous. The attempt to create props like walls or the moon through human beings who speak about what they are is just, absolutely risible. But then quite often there's a moment, often when Pyramus is grieving or Thisbe is grieving, where the tone actually does change. And you think, yeah, this is silly, this is non-naturalistic, but it has access to something powerful and emotional. And that turns the tables a bit on a play where we have been encouraged to laugh at. That is a problem in Shakespeare, that we do tend to laugh at lower class characters. If lower class characters are funny or generate humour, they don't quite know that they're doing it. Whereas upper class characters can be witty and generate humour in a knowing way. But we tend to be laughing down, if you like. But there's something about the way Shakespeare presents the roller coaster of Pyramus and Thisbe, which maybe turns that back on ourselves. We see the courtly audience for Pyramus and Thisbe being quite snooty about it.
Yes.
And I think that's a moment where we probably, as an audience in the theatre, think, oh, I'm not with them. I'm not part of the courtly world. I'm actually on the side of Bottom and his crew, and I want them to do a good job, and I'm sort of rooting for them. So something does shift in the audience affections, I think, in the play.
That's really brilliantly observed. You're absolutely right. We're not with the courtier critics. And yes, we're laughing at the haplessness of the performance. But I was going to ask you as well about the play within the play in this performance. There's also something loving about it, about the theater.
Yes.
And every production has to create its own version of this play and bring theatrical invention to it. And actually, if you think about the scene where they have to play the wall and Pyramus and Thisbe are supposed to speak through the chink in the wall, it's just brilliantly inventive theater by Shakespeare in its own right. So in a sense, that play, it feels like a celebration of theater. Even if you describe it amateur, actually it still has those elements of creativity and, as you say, unexpectedly, these moments of genuine emotion. So when you talked about the fact that the other characters, we don't seem to feel the depth of emotion about them, there are moments, though, with Bottom, who is a mortal character and an ordinary character, and maybe this comes back to class, that of course we laugh at him, and the Elizabethan audience no doubt would have recognized themselves to some degree in these characters. He is given some dignity ultimately in some ways, isn't he? Because he's a humble survivor, he's a fool, but in some ways actually a perceptive fool. And when he performs Pyramus, something genuine does happen.
I completely agree. So this is a play, we talked at the beginning about where this fits in Shakespeare's unfolding career. And one of the things that we might have said then is it's from the years of ensemble plays where you have distributed parts, no main character really, lots and lots of different actors doing their thing and carrying the play together, as opposed to the real star vehicle plays that we start to get for Richard Burbage, where he's the main character. If you look at the statistics about who speaks the most, it's very, very spread out, but Bottom is the top.
Wow.
So bottom is one steer through this play. And it may be the last irony of this play's knowingness about theatre and how theatre works, that out of the wreckage of this, what seems an awful play and these kind of thudding lines, nevertheless, we get access to this extraordinary emotion. And I think Shakespeare really loves that, because it's pretty much what he does again in The Mousetrap in Hamlet. On the one hand, we've got a kind of sophisticated audience looking back at this old form of drama and saying, oh God, isn't it awful? And these awful rhyming lines. But it is nevertheless a piercing moment where something real gets communicated. And this here in Midsummer Night's Dream is the tryout for that.
I think there are so many reasons why the play within the play is such a successful element of this as well. It may come back, Emma, to something as simple as that Shakespeare knew that universally somehow we love to watch theater about making theater. That still seems to be true. At least I certainly do. And he creates this great comic set piece. But even with their talking about their rehearsals and planning and all that, it's great to watch. They have a discussion, for example, about the suspension of disbelief and how that works, because they fear that the lion is going to be too scary for the audience. I mean, that is timeless, that discussion about suspension of disbelief. And of course, there are associations or analogies, aren't there, between the creation of theater and what goes on in dreams, what we've been witnessing in the fairy world, what the fairies create, the stories that they create. All these are different types of fictions. You mentioned Puck as the playwright. There are definitely these analogies. What is the source of creativity? The association between the stories and images we create in our dreams, or that the playwright creates on stage, which are simultaneously real but also unreal. And of course, the metaphor is famously spelled out by Puck at the end when he talks about the play we've just watched possibly being a dream.
That makes it feel, doesn't it, as if the real topic of the play is imagination, ours, the characters, the theatres. And that may add to this sense that you began with, which has been a really interesting structure for this conversation, that this is something new. And part of what seems to be new for Shakespeare is this extraordinary confidence in the medium. Because unless you were really confident in your own players and your own theatre, you wouldn't really want to bring on bad actors and bad theatre. Just, when Francis Flute says he can't play Thisbe because he's got a beard coming, he can't be the female character because he can't convincingly do that. You have to be quite confident in your Titania, your Hippolyta, your Helena, and your Hermia to do that, to bring that in. Otherwise, you destabilize or pull the rug from under the whole edifice. So there's a great confidence about the willingness of audiences to enter into the theatrical contract, I think, as well as a confidence in the Chamberlain's men and what they're able to bring off.
I mean, there's so many meta elements to this, aren't there? Because as you mentioned that, of course, the women are being played by boys in the play as well, which the audience is aware of. And we're watching this play within the play as the courtiers are watching the play within the play. And then Puck comes and breaks the fourth wall at the end and talks to us in the audience. I mean, it's all very sophisticated in that sense and very knowing, as you say, and very confident. Maybe even ultimately going back to Freud and all of that, calling into question our perceptions of reality, what we know, what we think we know, who we love. Where does that all come from? Where does our certainty or otherwise come from? You mentioned the language of the play at the beginning, and I definitely wanted to ask you about whether there was anything distinctive about Shakespeare's use of language in this play, in the evolution of his creative use of language. You did mention that there are different types of language going on here. Was that unusual?
I think he uses a sort of linguistic soundscape or aural field for these different plot strands in quite a different way, perhaps in quite a musical way, as I suggested. The lovers are given a lot of rhyming couplets. That's a way that their language embodies and reinforces the urge to couple off. That's how rhyming works. It pairs off lines, doesn't it? And that's a sort of appropriate for them and their plot line.
I love that. I've never thought that literally about rhyming couplets for couples. It certainly heightens the lyrical romantic idea, possibly even suggests a bit of a naivete as well in some of it.
I think that's right. And a kind of inevitability. Once you've set up a rhyme, you know that the rhyme is coming. And then we've got the early use of the kind of fairy language, which is short lines, again rhyming, but not pentameter lines. So Puck and the other parts of the fairy world speak in a different rhythm. I think what's important in lots of Shakespeare's use of different kinds of language is actually just the difference between them. It's not that any of the particular forms necessarily are meaningful or go with, but that the audiences are very tuned into the difference between them and the sense that this is a different world. So I do feel that there is a great enjoyment of these different linguistic worlds for the different groups of characters in the play.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It affirms what I read in the introduction to the third Arden edition, which talks about a newfound synthesis between the different types of language, verse and prose, for example, that connects to the action and the characters. As you've just described it beautifully, the different types of language associated with different types of characters or occasions that are therefore signals and support what's going on in terms of the action and our understanding of it. And of course, there's also just the usual plethora of beautiful phrasings and images, many of which now familiar, such as the course of true love never did run smooth. I love Puck's I'll put a girdle round the earth in 40 minutes. I mean, what a stunning, simple image just to convey that sort of supernatural air he inhabits. And also all sorts of poetic descriptions appropriate to the natural setting. You mentioned Titania's I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where ox slips and the nodding violet grows. I could go on because it's just so beautiful. I want to come back to the ending of the play, which you started by saying that we feel like the resolution of the plot, we come back to the harmony of a conventional comic conclusion, that the comfortable status quo has largely been restored. Do you think that's what's going on here? Conservative with a small c?
I think I probably do feel that, yeah. I think that whole green world structure that I mentioned at the beginning is itself quite conservative. So these aren't people who go, as it were, in modern terms and just drop out from the court and, live in a hippie commune or, go off grid or something. These are people who go almost to a kind of spa or a boot camp, if you want, and sort of work on themselves and then go back to be better citizens in the world that they belong in. So I do think, it's interesting how some modern versions of this have wanted to open up the ending. There was a wonderful Russell T Davies BBC version, which had a very oppressed Hippolyta, really, really leaned into the idea that she was a prisoner of war, that Theseus had taken her in war, wooed her with his sword. And I can't now remember whether it's Puck or one of the other women. Anyway, they just bring her free at the end and she just runs. She's not going to marry Theseus. So that's not how the play is, but I suppose it shows us one of the discontents that we might feel in the 21st century with the forms that the play closes with, which are these marriages. Although alongside that, I suppose, Hermia's defiance of her father has been endorsed by the plot. She's the one person who gets to marry who she thought she wanted to. She marries, checks notes. She marries Lysander, doesn't she? So she gets what she wants. But yeah, I do think it's a small c conservative ending. But within that, there is always the sense that the dream world or what's been accessed hasn't completely been lost, is still part of the current world.
I agree with your last sentence there. You're right, it's not explicit Hippolyta. There's some part of us wants her to stand up and somehow fight back because we feel her oppression, I think. But of course, that doesn't actually happen within the confines of the play. I'd go back to also what you said earlier about Demetrius, who just from the contrivance of the plot, he actually, as you rightly said, ends up with Helena only because the drug that's been administered to him is still in effect.
Mm.
So in some senses, at least him as a lover comes back out of the forest, not having learned very much about themselves. He hasn't been the agent for this proper ending. And I agree with you that I think that overall, there's a sense that the fickleness and chance that have played a part and are the fabric of the world we've seen in the wood in particular, that our perceptions and the future may be subject to more of these unpredictable changes and impulses. But this is not completely stable necessarily. What do you think?
Yes. That might be the great gift of Ovid's Metamorphoses to the imagination of this period, which is that change, difference evolution, whatever, is a constant.
Yeah.
We're in a constant state of inconstancy, and that therefore there is always the possibility to change into something else. And I think that is still hanging over the play, not least because, one possibility of transformation is to take yourself out of your everyday life. We see the characters who are weavers and carpenters and so on in real life within the play going off and finding a new world of theatre. And of course, that's performed before an audience of weavers and carpenters and people who have stepped out of the everyday world to go to the theatre. So those possibilities of an alternative world are still available, I think. They're not closed off by the very end of the play.
And if Puck is in some way the maestro of change, he talks in his final speech to us about how he asks the audience to pardon for any offense, as one does as an epilogue, and promises that they will make amends in the future, else call Puck a liar, which of course he might well be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Puck is entirely reliable. So the future is not necessarily reliable either.
No, but he's also saying, come back to our next play, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
We'll be here again. So if you didn't like this one,
yes,
we'll be doing a different one tomorrow or next week. So the theatre itself, the theatre in which this is being performed, is part of this magic. I sometimes think about those ideas about Hollywood as a sort of factory of dreams, and thinking that the theatre in the early modern period predates that. It is manufacturing dreams of alternative possibilities for people who come and watch them.
There can't be a better place to finish than that, with this greatest call to action to come back to the theatre again as the factory of dreams. Thank you, Emma. Before I let you go, I will remind you that one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast or just a personal favorite. And I will remind you that on your previous appearances, you recommended Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy and Jean Anouilh's version of Antigone, both of which I would love to do sometime. Have you got another one you could add to that list?
You've slightly stumped me. I was thinking of a play that you haven't done. I was going to say, having just recently seen it, Dancing at Lunacer.
Which we just did.
Which you just did, yeah. So I'm a bit stuck, but I think, there are still some Shakespeare plays to go through, Doug. I think we've still got more work to do. So next time you're going to something fantastic, let's do it again.
I would love to talk to you about any Shakespeare play. You're my go-to, Emma, I promise you. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation and lovely to see you again.
Thanks so much, Doug.
Before we bring the curtain down, just to say that the Globe's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream is running there until the 12th of August, 2023. Michelle Terry's Puck is worth the price of admission on its own, and incidentally, the music's also wonderful. Having had the joy of listening to Emma elucidate the play today, how can you not want to go and see it for real? As the curtain and night falls, and the fairies slip away, blessing the slumbering house containing the newly wedded couples, Puck teases us with the suggestion that all that we have seen may have been but a dream, these figures and events we have imagined, as the playwright himself has conjured them from nothing, and as we invent our own stories about what we know, who we love, and what we can never fathom. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the Play Review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.